Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., and delightfully today interviewing two fellow Methodists about their new book on the absolute basics of the Wesleyan Way, if I'm recalling the title correctly, soon to be published by Seedbed. One author is Justus at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. The other author is Philip Tallon at Houston Baptist University in Houston, obviously, where despite its name, apparently United Methodist faculty are not only permitted, but encouraged. So we're grateful for his Wesleyan witness there in Houston. I could elaborate on their biographies a little bit, but they know themselves better than I do. So Justus, tell us just a sentence or two more about who you are.
Sure. I'm assistant professor of church history at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. And I'm a scholar mostly of medieval scholasticism, interested in scholasticism writ large, and a United Methodist layperson, which is why we wrote the book.
And Philip?
Yeah, I'm an assistant professor of theology at Houston Baptist, and we like scholasticism as well. I mean, so we already figured out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but we know that they shouldn't because dancing is a sin. So, and I'm the interim dean in the School of Christian Thought, and I do a couple of other things here. We have a fine undergraduate great books program here in the Honors College that I'm always very proud to promote to people who are looking for sending their young people to a place that values the classics and wants to lead them through the great books and allows them to pursue any major they want. Nursing, engineering, all sorts of things.
Excellent. And near as I can tell, your new book, The Absolute Basics of the Wesleyan Way, is basically a primer to introduce Methodists to their own tradition. The challenge being that many Methodists know very little about what it actually means to be a Methodist. Justus, is that correct?
Yeah, that's been my experience. That's certainly been my experience. We wanted to write the book in a way that we just sort of assume that, you might grow up around Methodism. You might be a United Methodist or a Wesleyan of another sort, grow up in a church that is theoretically Methodist, but you would basically be exposed, maybe like Phil and I were, to bits and pieces of distinctively Wesleyan tradition, and then bits and pieces of this, that, and the other. And depending on sort of the concoction of things you were exposed to, you may not really know how the whole Methodist and Wesleyan thing fits together. We wanted to write a book that would help people kind of piece together all those bits and pieces and understand what it means to be a part of this heritage that is the Wesleyan tradition, and what our doctrinal and practical distinctives are. So they feel proud about it, and also a sense of ownership going forward.
And Philip, if you had to summarize to someone with no background in Methodism, what does it mean to be a Methodist?
Well, that's a great question. I think that the way that what Wesley shows us is that Methodists are serious about the forms of religion, which is to say they value practices, take acts of piety very seriously. We're not afraid of things associated with religion, right? With liturgy, with structure, with strong suggestions for these are the things that we should do. So we're willing to sort of be in danger at times of being accused of being legalistic, because we see that there are just certain things that are just true, that if you do these things, they're much better for you. But we're not legalists, because we think that there's this essential ingredient, which is the power of God, without which none of this makes any sense. And so if Wesley shows us, right, that no matter how many of these things you do, unless you have the grace of God working within you, none of it will ever give you the peace and the assurance, the joy and the life that God has for you. And so Methodists really want to kind of hold these two things together. And that's why we occupy, I think, a sort of a unique place amongst the family of denominations, as we're a little bit high, but not too high. We like big tent revivals and repentance, but we also want to organize people into groups, into churches, societies, learning, and teach them about liturgy as well.
And Justus, obviously the trend in American Christianity is towards non-denominational.
Mm-hmm.
If you were speaking to a non-denominational Christian or evangelical who says, why does it matter whether or not I adhere to a particular tradition, what would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there is the sense in which, you sort of can thin out Christianity's sort of its basic bones, and let's just sort of get along on this sort of very thin gruel. But I think that actually the time is done for that sort of thing. Okay, what we need are traditions that are thick and substantive. And one of my favorite Methodist theologians, as you know, Mark, is William Burt Pope. And William Burt Pope says very clearly, yes, there is sort of a general broad set of doctrines we share, a thin gruel, as it were, although the gruel is quite substantive. It's the Trinity, it's the hypostatic union. But what we need actually in order to practice a faith is a set of particular teachings about, the way of salvation, about what grace looks like and how it gets enacted in the life. We need a thick set of particular doctrines, not that diminish or take away from that sort of foundational substance we share with all other Christians, but which inform us on how we should live our Christian life in the day in, the day out, practices of prayer, of repentance, and of sort of personal piety. And I think that is really what we're trying to push here in the book, is that what we want is a very thick account of what it means to be a Wesleyan. And that's what's really going to kind of deliver the goods going forward. As we see, of course, as you know, Mark, non-denominational Christianity had a burst, but it's starting to decline as well, just like a lot of mainline traditions at this point. So we want to kind of rebuild the foundation of the Wesleyan tradition and reorient it around its particular doctrines and practices.
And Philip, if you're walking across the campus of HBU and someone comes up to you and says, I am a Calvinist Baptist, I reject infant baptism, I affirm predestination, what do you say as a Methodist?
Well, of course, as a Methodist, I believe in predestination because it's a biblical concept. As someone who says it like that, I mean, I'm not sure that there's, a good place to start. But if it's about defending the distinctives, obviously, Wesley's theology is, Anglican in that regard, which is to say he's, we ourselves are situated within the Anglican tradition, and Wesley is clearly, within Anglicanism, defends an Arminian account of, broadly speaking, of how you would defend that. And so, if I take your question to be something about like kind of how to sort of Methodists defend the sort of their distinct heritage, then I think that there are plenty of good there's a good scriptural case to be made for an Arminian account of salvation, libertarian free will, and so forth. So the best place to go when you're having a serious theological dispute, of course, is always the Bible, right? So we go to Romans 9-11 and we say, let's look at a different way of reading this than perhaps the way you've been taught. Yeah,
that is one thing that our book we try to kind of do, I think, is at least it's not too explicit about this, but actually a heavy Reformation emphasis on the activity of God and grace of election actually fits nicely, and this has always been the Anglican position and therefore the Methodist position, fits nicely with the view of infant baptism, actually. In fact, God chooses you, and your confession of faith, although important later in life in order to make your way along the way of salvation, is a affirmation that Methodists have often made that grace is sort of operative in your life and that you are gifted with the opportunity to participate in it. And so I've sometimes said, to friends that, one of the really interesting things about the Wesleyan tradition is that it's a tradition that insists that both you should be baptized as an infant. Your parents should make your confession of faith for you, ideally. And then also you should be prayed through at an altar, in kind of the holiness revivalistic tradition as well. And I don't really know of any other tradition that has that type of combination of things. But it all has to be grounded in a rich doctrine of operative divine grace and the grace of God, which initiates the pathway for our salvation. So I think they sort of fit together, actually, in my mind.
And the typical Methodist in America, whether they're United Methodist or whether they belong to one of the smaller, more evangelical Wesleyan denominations, what is their typical knowledge gap in terms of what it means to be a Methodist?
What do you think, Phil?
Well, of course, I'm not primarily concerned with, how exactly United Methodists are doing. I think, of course, what we're trying to do in this text is provide a resource that can be used by United Methodists, but, other people from other parts of the Wesleyan movement. In some sense, Wesley led a great revival tradition that sort of stooped to become a denomination here in the U.S. And so this is a much bigger heritage than our denomination. But within the United Methodist Church, where I've spent most of my life, certainly the average layperson has a fairly low understanding of the prescribed things that you're intended to learn as laid out in the Book of Discipline, right? So the Book of Discipline says you should learn United Methodist doctrine, United Methodist history, and United Methodist polity as sort of the three parts of confirmation. And I think we do very little to educate people in polity, and also very little in the distinctives of our denomination's theology. We do very little just in general theology as well. So I think the average layperson, if you press them to just, can you just talk to me about what it means that Jesus is fully God and fully human, wouldn't get very far without falling into heresy or silence. And so we live in an age where we have high levels of awareness of many, many things, but very little ability to explain and articulate, kind of core concepts of our faith or almost anything else. I mean, it's sort of like, I can use all this technology, right? But if I was transported back 1,000 years and attempted to try and teach people about modern science and modern technology, I couldn't get very far, right? I mean, just like, well, you pressed a button and the thing sort of just works, and there's some power that flows through it. I don't really deeply understand most of the things that I use, my car, my computer, and I think most people are like this. They have a kind of an operational sense of church life, but very little of a deep understanding. But that's something that Christians traditionally have been instructed in and expected to know.
Yeah, I think it's a confluence of things in the sense of that perhaps there was a time when we could sort of default and assume that sort of culture or basic Christian preaching would deliver this content. Maybe you sing a lot of Charles Wesley hymns, so you have kind of a robust Trinitarian sensibility. But that's sort of gone, and so the foundation, as I think I've said before, needs a little bit of care, is my experience as well. Now, I do think there are some traditions in the Wesleyan family who've done a little better job. I was raised and I guess you would say catechized in the Free Methodist Church, and there certainly been a sense of sort of doctrinal distinctives, but also especially a sense of emphasis on the activity of the Holy Spirit in making a life holy and pure. And I actually think that there's something in the Wesleyan tradition about this orientation toward, for Wesley, as he said, the grand deposit of the Methodists was entire sanctification. You sort of fix in your constellation this point, and it provokes a lot of questions about the God in whose likeness you are being transformed and so forth, which are fertile soil to understand these things. But I think regrettably in United Methodism, outside of the holiness realm, that's kind of been let go in a way for the most part, such that you sort of are left in this very kind of compromised doctrinal and theological position where, the last thing you want to do is step on anyone's toes. So just sort of sit back and be non-committal and hear everyone out. That's pretty much the recipe for disaster when it comes to catechesis and formation.
Perhaps the greatest knowledge gaps among American Methodists, not just knowledge, but experience, would be on these topics of holiness and entire sanctification. How would you explain those concepts to a novice?
Are they for novices? I mean, the Wesleyan tradition has had a debate about this, whether or not it's sort of an experience which one should expect in the present here and now, which certainly seems to be Wesley's heavy emphasis in a sermon like the Scriptural Way of Salvation, which we made a kind of key point, a pivot around this book kind of pivots around that sermon in important ways. But I think that Wesley's own book on a plain account of Christian perfection, Phil and I talked about this as we were kind of preparing. We ended up adding a whole chapter for our book, The Absolute Basics of the Wesleyan Way, on the doctrine of entire sanctification. So we devote a whole chapter to this topic, which I think is kind of a distinctive feature of the book. Because we felt like we wanted to give the doctrine clear articulation, to answer some questions, and deal with some objectives, which is exactly what Wesley does in the plain account of Christian perfection. Phil, do you want to say anything about those kind of the key objections you encountered?
Well, I think when you speak to a novice about it, I mean, obviously there's some basic terminologies to talk about, and justification, new birth, the power of sin being broken in us, and entire sanctification, this being or presence of sin being removed from us by divine grace. One of the ways we talk about it in the book is almost in more positive terms, instead of letting, as it were, sanctification be about just about sin removal. We talk about how sanctification is this sort of level of absorbing divine grace, so that you're at peace with God and at rest with God, right? And so perhaps it's a more sort of Augustinian, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee, is this experience of satisfaction with God, such that we don't look to anything else, for our needs. And so compare it to a really good, right? Have this really good meal and you're satisfied with that.
Yeah, that is a key image we use. That sort of you have a beautiful meal, and it's not that you're sort of. You ever have these meals where you're like sort of the food is so good, but then there's too much of it. You just want more and more, and so you get all out of balance. It's like the perfect meal, but also it's sort of given to you in the perfect proportion, so that at the end of it, you're perfectly satisfied in the sense of rest. And that's exactly what the soul and the will is. It desires to rest in God, and when God is given to it, it has that kind of perfect satiation. I think that's the positive picture we wanted to deal with. Of course, we also wanted to kind of answer, what is it that we are perfected in? What is it that we leave behind? Will we no longer willfully violate a known law of God? We kind of unpack, I think, a little bit about what that means. So it's not like you'll still have toothaches, Mark. You'll still have eye problems potentially, if you have an injury or something, that's still going to happen to you, and you'll also be ignorant and make mistakes.
Yeah.
So those are not what we're talking about. But in terms of your heart being purified, because it has been given such a gift of grace and been received, so that you're satisfied and at rest and inner peace will characterize all your actions. That's what the doctrine of entire sanctification.
And then finally, and this topic is likely outside the parameters of your book, but there is, and the two of you are part of it, a renaissance of Methodist and Wesleyan scholarship. And it's often, perhaps unfairly, said that Methodists and Wesleyans are not where some of the other Protestant traditions are intellectually and in terms of scholarship, but are the Methodists potentially catching up in the areas of intellectual life, or do we even have that capacity given our history is more focused on action than on thought, perhaps?
I'd like to hear Phil's thought on this, actually. I'll share mine too, but I'd like to hear what Phil has to say.
Well, I think there are certainly promising signs. There's there are kind of movements and kind of gatherings of people who are doing really valuable work. Certainly there's in biblical scholarship, some of the work in New Perspective and so forth is very consonant with, Wesleyan, theology. And so some of the most exciting work that's being done in terms of, biblical scholarship can, fits very well with the, Wesleyan view. I'm not I don't have any strong sense, though, that we're on the sort of cusp of a Wesleyan Renaissance. I mean, I think in that's partly because, I think that in many ways, when we really see people who are kind of influenced by Wesley and sort of moved by Wesley, sort of going out and doing sort of broader work, really doing work that would be the kind of, sort of grand theological work. In some ways, it won't necessarily be recognizable as being distinctively Wesleyan, partly because so much of Wesley work on Wesley has been sort of, focused on sort of the person himself and the sort of the recent movement. And so, but I do see a lot of Wesleyan scholars kind of going out and doing, exciting work all over the place. Definitely people like Tom McCall, and his philosophical work is incredibly exciting and wonderful to see in the area of analytic theology. And then we see, Billy Abraham going to Baylor, starting up a, Wesleyan Study Center. That's certainly very exciting. So there's some things to be excited about. Who knows if it's going to be a movement in any significant way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that there's a hope. I mean, there are a lot of us sort of committed to taking seriously the tradition we've received and trying to figure out how to kind of get the mechanics of that thing working. I would say that there are more promising signs on the horizon than maybe there were at some point a generation or so ago, probably. I mean, maybe this is self-interested, but I like to think that the kind of efforts of the John Wesley Fellows and Foundation for Theological Education has been fruitful. Insofar as, I mean, I don't know that the foundation. I'm a John Wesley Fellow, so I don't know the foundation achieved its goal of sort of revolutionizing all the seminaries in the United Methodist Church. But it was quite successful in supporting and launching a number of people who would be sort of committed to Orthodox account of Wesleyan tradition in a robust and straightforward way. And I think we're seeing the fruit of that in certainly my generation of scholars. What will come of that? I mean, we're in delicate times, Mark. As you know, we are going to rely on our leaders and the generations above us to kind of foster and make space for us to cultivate a culture that will be theologically enlivening. And so much will matter about the decisions made about how the future of theological formation and education will take place in a global Methodist tradition in the future. I'm not really sure what the answer is to that, but we definitely have significant need for support of this sort of nucleus of young scholars, I think, that are starting to kind of percolate and move into their own voice in the academy and the church.
It's sort of a good question as to what degree you can have a genuine, real theological revival unless there's ecclesial revival. It does seem like there are theologians who have done incredible work in the midst of a church that's failing in some sense, but it's very, I mean, I can imagine it's very possible within the United States. Of course, it's the context in which we're working. There's a vast Wesleyan movement globally, but that if there's sort of significant kind of church revival and an excitement within the church, not just sort of given to sort of squabbling or just constantly having to kind of like fight back and forth, that we could see a real sort of shift and perhaps kind of a new characteristic to Wesleyan theology. So who knows what the next stage is for the United Methodist Church, but that may in fact change things.
I do have one thought on this. Try to shoot quickly. I've written about this a couple of different places, and I think at some future pieces we'll talk about this. I think Tom Oden is actually the person to look to. The IRD will be interested for me to say this, of course, because I think Oden saw that in traditions who had sort of crumbled in their foundations, when a theologian asked what they should do, what task should they put upon themselves, going back to sort of the spirit and heart of early Christian biblical interpretation, doctrine, and life is always a good recipe for that. So and I think that's exactly what a lot of us have done, what I've certainly tried to commit myself to and continue to commit myself to. I found a lot of energy amongst our clergy and students about this, that sort of going back and taking a deep investment in the early Christian tradition will actually kind of give you this sort of critical edge and renewal that you're oriented to. That's what the Oxford movement did. that's in some ways what Wesley did. The Cambridge Platonists maybe sort of similar parallel to that, amidst a sort of decaying church. And so, soldier on, Odin followers, I think is my message there.
On that reference to our favorite saint, Tom Odin, who served on the board of IRD for many years. Thank you, Justus Hunter and Philip Tallon, for a very good conversation on your new impending book, The Absolute Basics of the Wesleyan Way.
Thanks. It's available for pre-order now from seedbed.com.
Absolutely.